Welcome back to the Recipe Analyst. Today we're going to be making Belgian Style Yeast Waffles from King Arthur's Baking Companion. So this recipe calls for lukewarm milk. So after I weigh and measure out about 1.5 cups of milk, I'm just going to throw that into the microwave on about 50% power for a minute to a minute and a half. And we're going to check it after each interval just to see what that temperature is looking like. We're also going to measure out some butter since we need the butter to be melted, so I have that sitting to the side while that milk is warming up. Also going to weigh out our flour and the rest of our dry ingredients while we're warming up the milk and butter. So we're going to add 3/4 teaspoons of salt, 1.5 teaspoons of instant yeast. And then we're gonna check on that milk, and then we can throw in our butter to get that melted. And I recommend you cover your butter if you're gonna microwave it, because it tends to make a big mess if it pops while it's melting. And here I'm just gonna check the temperature of that milk. It's still a little bit cold, so when that butter comes out, I'm just gonna put it back in for a few more seconds. So once the butter gets to this stage, I just like to stir it since it does like to pop when it gets mostly liquid. The heat that's existing in the melted butter is enough to melt the rest of the butter. So I'm just gonna go ahead and stir that to get it mostly melted down. So you can see that the residual heat from the butter was able to melt the non-melted butter. And now we can get started mixing the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients. So we're going to go ahead and pour in the milk. Followed by the butter. And I actually had just a little bit less than the 85 grams or 6 tablespoons of butter. So I made sure to scrape out as much of the butter as I could. I guess the butter gave me butterfingers as I dropped the eggshell into the batter mixture. Get both of those eggs in there. And then some vanilla extract. And then the maple syrup is optional. It says 2 to 3 tablespoons of maple syrup. I had just a little bit less than 2 tablespoons, and I just went ahead and used all of it. Now we're just going to go ahead and mix that batter. So what I'm going for here is just to make sure that I don't see any streaks of dry flour in the mixture, and make sure those eggs are broken up. It's okay if there's still some lumps. We're going to let this sit for at least an hour, and actually I'm going to let it go overnight in the refrigerator after that hour, which is completely optional. And you're going to see me use this silicone cover instead of plastic wrap to let it sit out for about an hour before I transfer it to the refrigerator. And you can definitely smell some of that fermentation from the yeast. Now throw the top onto the bowl and let it rest overnight. Now it's the next morning. It's been about 12 hours. We're going to pull it out of the refrigerator, and let's look at what the yeast has done after 12 hours. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of bubbles here. So hopefully it has some pretty good flavor. So the recipe calls for about 3/4 cup to a cup of the batter to go into the waffle iron, but it really just depends on your waffle iron and how big it is. I'll spray it down with some, well, this is canola oil actually, but it calls for vegetable oil. It should be fine either way. And then just spoon the batter into the waffle iron. So this waffle iron has its own kind of timer. It'll let you know when the waffle is ready. It took about 5 minutes to cook through. Now I'm just gonna take it out, put it on a plate. I decided to go ahead and move my setup under the vent hood just because there's a lot of steam coming off of it. Now it's just rinse and repeat for the remaining waffles. This recipe says it'll make about 4 waffles, and that's pretty much exactly what I got. I had a very small amount of batter left over, but you couldn't really make a big waffle out of it. You might be able to make a pancake out of it if you wanted to, or maybe fry it into some kind of fried batter. Maybe I'll try that next time. As you can see, I did get some overflow on some of these waffles. So for me, it took just in between 3/4 and a full cup to get a full waffle. But of course, it's going to depend on your specific waffle iron, how much batter you're going to need to put in there. And that's the last waffle. They are looking pretty good, but how did they taste? So I ended up giving these waffles a 6 out of 10. They do look better than the rating would suggest. I gave them a 6 out of 10 mostly because of the flavor. There just wasn't a lot of flavor in these waffles. The texture was really good, as you might be able to hear here. They have a pretty nice crisp exterior, and the interior is really soft and almost creamy. But the flavor, when you don't add syrup, is really lacking. You can kind of tell that it is yeasted. You can kind of get a little bit of tanginess from that fermentation in the waffle batter, especially since I had it in the refrigerator overnight. But other than that flavor, there's not a lot going on here. It is a little bit on the eggy side without the syrup. And then when you do add the syrup, it does make it better, as you would expect, with some sweetness from the maple syrup, maybe a little bit of nuttiness depending on the maple syrup you do use. But I really think that this waffle is tailored towards someone who likes to load up their waffles with like strawberries, whipped cream, any other toppings besides just eating them plain, or even just maple syrup, because they really stand up to the maple syrup pretty well. They are a very sturdy waffle. I don't think they would get soggy very easily. Anyway, that's all I have for these Belgian style yeast waffles from King Arthur's Baking Companion. If you want to read a little bit more on it, you can go to the blog, therecipeanalyst.com. Thanks for watching.